Today, we will talk about the consensus date for the Exodus. When did the Exodus actually occur? Well, there are two major theories, and in our last video, we dealt with the traditional date, which is kind of the one that I accept. And if you haven't seen that video, you might want to check that out. You can also find that on my channel here. Today is the consensus date, which is part two, and we're going to talk about if the Exodus was later. I want to remind all viewers that there is a school of thought out there, and I have to say that I have looked at the evidence and they have a strong case. However, I still believe in the traditional date, but with a caveat to that, because we're going to talk about the Exodus in a very different light in later videos. And so I'm going to talk about some very new ideas about the Exodus. But there is a school of thought out there that there are some who believe, many scholars who believe that the Israelites were never in Egypt, and that the story of the Exodus was made up after the children of Israel came back from Babylon, and it was made up by priests in order to bolster national pride and national loyalty and things like that. I know this might be new to a lot of people, but there's a lot of evidence to support this idea, although I don't share it. Today, number one, we dealt with the traditional date last time in the other video, and that would have been the 18th dynasty around 1450. Today, we deal with the consensus date, which would have occurred in around 1250 BC during the 19th dynasty. In 1956, this is a good place to start, I think. In 1956, Cecil B. DeMille portrayed the story of Moses. In the movie, he takes the position that the pharaoh of the oppression and the pharaoh of the Exodus was actually Ramses II of the 19th dynasty. There is good reason for him to take this position, and it's probably, given the knowledge at the time, it's probably the best position and the most widely accepted. One of the big reasons for this is Exodus chapter 1, verse 11. Referring to the Israelites, the Bible says, "So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Pi-Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh." Now, one of the things that archaeologists have focused on is the location of Pi-Ramses. It's also called Ramesses. For many years, there was a lot of studies to indicate that Tanis was Pi-Ramses, but the stratigraphic and literary evidence for Tanis just didn't hold up under scrutiny, so it's not really widely held anymore. And so there are a lot of theories about where exactly was Pi-Ramses. Nevertheless, what this actually does is points us to the direction that the Exodus occurred in the 19th dynasty, given the idea that the name in the city is Ramses. Ramses II was a very important pharaoh. He's an incredible pharaoh. This warrior pharaoh was to reign for 67 years. He brought peace to his empire, fathered nearly 200 children, and he has left his mark on at least half the monuments of Egypt. So he was an incredible pharaoh. It is important then to note that the reason why Ramses was such a great pharaoh was because of his father, Seti I. Seti I was actually a military commander in the 18th dynasty, and Seti I is actually the founder of the 19th dynasty. So we have a reference to Seti I in Akhenaten's reign, and so he founds the 19th dynasty and he becomes the father of Ramses II. So given all the evidence for what we're talking about today, it seems that Ramses II may have been the pharaoh of the Exodus. If this is also, if that's the case, we also need to consider Ramses' son. Renepta, who succeeded him. Renepta is also a very important pharaoh because Renepta gives us a very important piece of evidence. This is the Renepta Stela. It's dated to around 1208 BC. I've seen other dates that says 1220 BC. So and remember I give a 50-year margin of error, so it still fits in. Anyway, the Renepta Stela is very important because this is the first time in the history of the world that we have a reference to Israel. You can see on the stela, it's close to the bottom. The reason for this is that Renepta is listing all of the cities and places that he conquered in Canaan, and he mentions Israel as one of the people he conquered. Now, it is worth noting here that when Renepta lists the places that he conquered, he lists them as places, but when it comes to Israel, he mentions them as a people. You can see the hieroglyphic name there to the right. The first glyph is a lady sitting, the next one is a man sitting, and then underneath are 3 hash marks. The 3 hash marks indicate the plural for a people. So this is a very important piece of evidence that says that when Israel is mentioned, it is mentioned as a people amongst names that actually refer to places. Anyway, the translation reads that Israel is laid waste and their seed is no more. There is a lot of indirect evidence for supporting the a late Exodus, which would have been 1250 BC. One of the pieces of evidence is an indirect statement from Ramses' campaigns into Canaan. Ramses' military campaign into Canaan appears to have occurred around his 18th year of reign. Those who advocate a 13th century Exodus, they have suggested that this campaign that Ramses on may have been a search and destroy mission for escaped Israelite slaves. Though this is not conclusive, and far be it from conclusive, some advocates say this is a veiled or a indirect reference to escaped Israelites. In the treaty that Ramses made with the Hittite king, well, Ramses engaged the Hittite Empire and the war ended in a draw. So Ramses and the Hittite king drew up a treaty. This treaty is very important, and it's going to come into play a few other times. But for right now, the treaty contains a very interesting statement. It's kind of peculiar, actually. It says, if my own subjects commit another crime against me, you, the Hittite king, will come to my cause to suppress such a disorder. The reference that another crime, some people have taken this to mean that he's referring to the other time as the Israelites. That is to say that whenever the Israelites escape, he didn't want that to happen again. So therefore, he makes it part of his treaty that if it happened again, that the Hittite king would also help him to suppress it. Moses' law is very interesting because it has a particular format. Now that format is highly sophisticated, and there's only a few places that he could have gotten such a format, and that is an international treaty for Egyptian. Egypt in the 3rd millennium had a way of structuring their treaties. Because a treaty is a covenant, it was very important that it be done correctly and in a particular way and in a particular format. That's Egyptian. Moses' law is in the very same element, very same format. So therefore, for those who say that the Exodus did not occur, they're going to have to explain why this treaty, why this covenant, why Moses' law is in the format of an Egyptian treaty. This is very sophisticated, and you just can't dismiss it. There are very few people, even during this time, who could write this treaty. The treaty itself is in a very, very sophisticated format, and Moses' covenant is also in the same format. We also have the four-room house. That's what it's called. It's the Israelites used this structure of house. It was never used by the Egyptians, and it was never used by anybody else. Only the Israelites used this house, and we have found that house. I think we found two of them in Thebes, in Egypt. So for people who say that the Israelites were never in Egypt, this is a piece of evidence to support that they were there. As I said, in later videos, we're going to talk about this in more detail, but in a very different light about the Israelites being in Egypt. There are many pieces of evidence, many of them indirect pieces of evidence, for supporting the idea that the Exodus occurred in the 19th dynasty under Ramses or perhaps Renepta. The idea for many of these pieces of evidence are always indirect, which is kind of frustrating, but nevertheless, it has caused scholars to say that if the Exodus did occur, the most likely time that it occurred would have been in the 13th century, around 1250 BC.